Thanks everyone for joining in for another Wildlife Wednesday of the Center for Wildlife Studies. My name is Jeff Stetz. I'm the Director of Science and Assistant Professor with the Center. And one of my perks of my job is to help host this series where we invite either colleagues or other instructors or faculty or even consultants affiliated with the Center for Wildlife Studies to share with us their research, how it links to their educational programs, just what they get excited about. It's a chance to help share some of the great work that our colleagues are involved with. It was the highlight of my week. Pretty darn close. Normally I'm tuning in from Alaska. This is a new one for me. I decided to pop over to Grand Rapids, Michigan this time, and it thought to be appropriate setting in a local city park, which is appropriate for the title for the topic today. I was able to see. We just went to the little shop for this, the Heinrich Meyer Botanical Gardens in Grand Rapids, and it's in the area. I grew up in Michigan. I never actually made it there, but it's a fantastic place. Everyone gets a chance. Just a beautiful series of gardens and sculptures, and really nice surprise. But today it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Elsa Anderson. Elsa is an urban ecologist who specializes in the social ecological overlaps of human activities and ecological form and function in cities. She uses a mix of field sampling, GIS, and social ecological synthesis science to assess distributions and changes in biodiversity patterns in urban areas. Currently, much of her work is focused on building capacity for environmental groups to improve biodiversity, nature spaces, and environmental outreach in their communities. She co-generates ecological research and leads workshops with local leaders that help fill community-identified knowledge gaps to advocate for healthy and accessible environments for people and wildlife. And I feel like I'm in the right spot for this. If folks have questions, we will be happy to address those in the end, both anything related to Center for Wildlife Studies or for Elsa's research or teaching. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Can you all hear me? Can you give me a thumbs up, Jeff, if my volume's coming through okay?
That sounds pretty good to me.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, everybody, for joining me here. Actually calling in from Berlin, Germany, where I'm based these days. So for those of you in Europe, thank you especially for joining me in the middle of the night. For those of you across the pond, good to see you. I do hark from the city of Chicago, so I'm very familiar with the American context where I've done a lot of my work. We're going to talk about that today. Like Jeff mentioned, I am an urban ecologist. I focus most of my work on social drivers and implications of urban biodiversity. So maybe a little bit of a deviation from some of the other Wildlife Wednesday talks, but hopefully we'll really get into some interesting things and maybe push your thinking in some new directions. Before I dive in too deep, I do want to make sure that I thank all of the amazing people I've had the chance to work with over the years on the projects that I'm going to present here today. My team at UIC, my team at the Chicago Botanic Garden and the Nature Conservancy, and the students I worked with at Northwestern University. I also want to pay tribute to the people who have deep ties to the land in Chicago that we can only scratch the surface of in our contemporary system of trying to understand land. Potawatomi tribes, Odawa tribes, Sauk, Ojibwe, Illinois, Kickapoo, Miami, Mascoutin, Wea, Delaware, Winnebago, Menominee, and Meskwaki tribes have all found homeland in the landscape that we have very dramatically modified, and these people are still part of the rich tradition of land stewardship in Chicago and beyond. And I also want to posit that when we share the stories of urban environments, they carry with them a lot of traumas and challenges for a variety of different people. And when we talk about urban environments, it really needs to be with an eye towards the systems that have gotten us to where we are and ways that we can actually work on broadening the tent for equity and justice and inclusion in healthy urban ecosystems. And then to kind of root this all in a deep sense of humanity and the relationship between people and the environment that we live in, I like to start my talks with a poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay called City Trees. The trees along this city street, save for the traffic and the trains, would make a sound as thin and sweet as trees in country lanes. And people standing in their shade, out of a shower undoubtedly, would hear such music as is made upon a country tree. O little leaves that are so dumb against the shrieking city air, I watch you when the wind has come. I know what sound is there. I really like this poem because it points at the deep connection that we have with nature in our everyday lives, no matter where we are. And more often, we are urban. The balance between urban and rural populations has recently shifted to a globally dominated urban humanity. We're seeing people move away from rural villages and into urban centers at a very rapidly growing rate. By 2050, the UN projects that 3 out of every 4 people will live in cities worldwide. And the United States, where most of my research that I'm presenting today takes place, that is likely to be closer to 9 out of every 10 people. And so cities are not only these spaces where we're living and working and pursuing economic activities and family life, but they're also more and more often the places where we're connecting with the environment. And that doesn't always look the same as what we might expect coming from a Western tradition. People who are moving to cities worldwide are often flocking to slums and favelas, where they are generating this kind of economic trajectory of growth for them and for their families, with some serious environmental consequences, both at the landscape scale with what is happening as we turn more of our urban area or more of our land area over to urban development, and also for the people who are living in these conditions where sanitation is limited and there are other environmental challenges. With this movement, though, we also see a tremendous shift in what life looks like. Around the world, we are seeing, for the first time in our human development, human evolution, areas that are more impervious than vegetated, especially in rapidly urbanizing parts of the world, such as South America, Africa, Oceania, and Asia. Much of our land cover is more built than not, which means that not only are we missing out on the ecosystem services of the biodiversity that we're transplanting, but we're also missing out on what it means to connect with nature on a human level. This loss of knowledge and of connection with nature has been described as an extinction of experience, where we have this feedback loop that comes from this loss of opportunity, loss of orientation, and children especially, but also adults are impacted by this. And then this feeds back into how they're engaging with the system more broadly. Specifically from a nature perspective, we have this loss of nature and loss of nature contact and experience, which causes a disconnect, which leads to unawareness or ignorance of nature, apathy, which then leads people to engage in progressively deleterious systems or behaviors. And these are not necessarily deliberate choices. This is a collective psychology that's kind of underpinning a lot of what's happening in our urban environments. And so for those of us who are logging into a talk like this, for those of us who are working in this field, I think it's really important to recognize that conservation and biodiversity work is not value neutral. We do not exist in a vacuum where the actions of people can be ignored, or the behaviors and psychologies of human groups can be discounted. We are really kind of living in this wheel that is turning. And in order to really kind of make conservation progress, to make sustainability progress, to offer these kind of stories of hope that we want to be offering, we also need to examine this intersection between the social system and the biological and ecological systems as they overlap in various parts of the world. This is not just my idea. This has also been a key tenet of much of the environmental policy at a global scale over the last several years. The 2020s were listed as the decade on ecosystem restoration, and urban areas, when this was put out, were listed as a core ecosystem. And at the time, this was really novel. The talk of urban areas as being part of kind of the solution to a lot of our global environmental issues was new. But urban areas are where people live. They are where people are connecting with nature. They are often in biodiversity hotspots, and they are huge opportunities for creative thought, for engaging with different types of systems and structures that are really powerful in putting some of these pieces back together. And it's important to think about this for what it actually is, right? When we're talking about ecosystem restoration, I think a lot of people come to this with the idea that restoration always has kind of pristine, fully recovered ecosystems as the end goal. But actually, restoration can be thought of as a continuum where we can think about these small steps towards reducing impacts, improving ecosystem management, and repairing ecosystem function as being critical in our moving towards a system that is more holistic, that has better ecological flows, that allows for resilience to things like pest outbreaks, to floods, to the increasing pressures of climate change. And this side of the spectrum, even into this kind of initiating native recovery, is all possible within our patchwork quilt of urban landscapes. And so as this effort has been kind of underway from an ecological perspective, this initiative to green our cities has really gained a lot of traction. But we need to take into account that cities are not just biological spaces. They certainly are places and templates where that plays out, where we do have, flows of matter and energy happening across this entire biological hierarchy, but they also are intensely social. And the social domain can be thought of similarly as having these different hierarchical structures, ranging from individual people who make decisions and have impacts, up to these kind of collective groups where there's exchange of knowledge, there are norms that are formed, there are values that are held, and this moves all the way up to a global population. And we can think about human habitats as being the source, or the place in which ecological science can really marry with social science to develop an ecology for cities. This is language from Stuart Pickett and his colleagues at the Carey Institute. And the idea can be here that ecology can really be a force for good. It can be a force for conservation benefit. It can be a force for justice and equity work. It can be a source for healing some of the climate and environmental wounds that we are grappling with. If we take the premise that we can take these scientific disciplines and use them to work towards these value-laden goals of well-being, conservation, etc. And so I want to take you to my hometown of Chicago to talk a little bit about some of the work that I have done with this kind of mindset approach. So Chicago is the third largest city in the United States. It's in the center of the country at the base of Lake Michigan, which is one of the Great Lakes. This is the largest freshwater ecosystem in the world. And as you might imagine, Chicago did not always look like this amazing skyline. It really is a pioneering city in the building of skyscrapers. But early Illinois, pre kind of industrialized Illinois, not particularly amenable to this kind of building. It was a lot of grasslands, tall grass prairie especially, and then the area along where Chicago actually is was wetland, was swamp. And so there had to be this tremendous restructuring of the entire landscape to support the development of this huge city. And this happened in two kind of primary ways. The first of which was the invention of the steel plow. And you can see in this map here, the replacement of this grassland ecosystem with agriculture, which is shown here in the yellow. When John Deere invented the steel blade plow, it was able to cut through the roots of these prairie ecosystems, which had been growing for thousands and thousands of years under native stewardship. And the steel plow was very effective at destroying that ecosystem and turning it over for rich agricultural land. This was then able to feed a growing city, which was additionally facilitated by some major hydrological changes, including propping the entire city up and backfilling what used to be this wetland swamp at the confluence of the Great Lakes and the Chicago River, which runs right in through the middle of downtown. So Chicago in and of itself exists as the result of this tremendous landscape change, but it also is current Chicago is a result of social policy and the history of movement of people in the United States. The maps that you're looking at here, you don't necessarily need to know all of the details, but the point here is that Chicago has always been a city of neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods have largely been defined by racial and ethnic lines. These are settlement maps from the early 1920s and the middle of the 20th century that really show this kind of strong consolidation of communities of people in our neighborhoods. And much of this ties in very, very closely with questions of environmental justice and how do particularly communities of color experience the burdens of poor environmental quality in and around our cities, because cities are major sources of environmental challenges. And so you can see here the area in Chicago that was listed as hazardous for lending mortgage purposes, and it is disproportionately affecting Black communities. And these communities are still tightly consolidated around these areas that were, as a direct result of government policies, were cut off from a huge amount of resources. Whereas the surrounding landscape that is primarily white did not have that same kind of burden to deal with. And this leads me right into kind of my next point here, is that we are still seeing the effects of these racialized and segregated community policies that happened in the earlier parts of the 20th century and even a little bit later in Chicago today. And this has environmental effects. So we're going to talk a little bit about vacant lots in Chicago. I did my dissertation looking at the biodiversity in vacant lots across the city. And part of what prompted this question is I was living down here on the south side of the city and traveling up north to the north side of the city for grad school. And I realized, looking out the window of the train, how different the city looks in different parts. We have these kind of ideas of what a poorer neighborhood looks like and what a wealthier neighborhood might look like. But that bore out in the green space too. There was lots of green open area on the south side of the city that was primarily vacant lots. And I was really interested in what does this actually mean for habitat? How do these vacant lots kind of come into existence? What do they mean for biodiversity conservation? And so we were looking at all the vacant lots that were owned by the city of Chicago. At the time of this study, there were about 1,300 vacant lots, representing an area, when we combined it all together, that was larger than the Chicago Park District and the Forest Preserve District combined. And so there's this huge land resource that is tightly associated with lower income communities. You can see here on this map that vacant lots shown in little black dots are highly associated with areas that at the time had a median household income of below $30,000 a year. That being said, this is a land source that can either be viewed as a blight or an opportunity. And many of the local communities were interested in trying to find a way to turn this into something positive, rallying around these spaces for developing places for children to play or community gardens. So much so that the city got involved and realized that they could engage the community and work with them to steward this land a little bit better by developing a program to sell these lots to residents on the block for the price of $1. There were some stipulations around this, where people had to kind of take over the lot and the management of the lot and the property taxes of the lot. They had to live on the block or in adjacent blocks. They had to be community members. And this program was very popular. Many communities saw lots purchased by their community members, and it changed the way that these lots were seen. They were much better integrated into the community space. There was a lot less illegal activity in these lots when it was a community member who owned them. And they also started to change ecologically. And we were kind of just seeing this happening as it was rolling out and realized that we needed to know a lot more about what was going on in vacant lots and how they were participating in the ecological system, because they look very different. There's a huge amount of variety when you have 13,000 lots across the city. And so we started asking very basic questions about, what's growing in these lots? How does the way that people care for them shape what kinds of species of plants we're seeing here? And how does that potentially influence the broader habitat that they might be supporting across the city of Chicago? And so we asked the question of, how does fencing on a lot, so you can see a fence line in the middle here, how does fencing of a lot and mowing of a lot interact to shape the biodiversity of that lot itself? And we did surveys of the lot interiors and of the lot perimeters to try and see if there were any biodiversity differences based on these two different management schema that we suspected, having seen many situations like this where right along the property line the lots look very different from one another. And we found a couple of interesting things. When we looked at the effect of mowing over an 11-year period, we got mowing records from the city. We found that lots that were mowed infrequently versus lots that were mowed intensively really didn't differ from one another. What you're seeing here is an NMDS plot where the axes don't really matter. What is most important is how close together the dots are. The dots that are closer together have more similar plant communities than dots that are farther apart. And you can see that there's not really any association, any clear pattern between these different mowing regimes. We did the same method, though, looking at the fence lines of lots and the interiors of lots, and found a very clear relationship or separation in the plant communities found along found along the fence lines shown down here in the lighter gray, and found in the lot interiors themselves. And so we picked into this a little bit further and found that fence lines are really hosting a unique collection of species. Many of these are woody species. Many of them are introduced kind of weedier tree species that are growing along these fence lines. And lot interiors are dominated by more herbaceous flowering plants. And so this gives us a clear indication that these spaces are being managed in a way that actually kind of divides up the habitat, and creates a different suite of structures across the landscape that are going to be providing for different kinds of species. Birds really love this kind of shrubby habitat that forms along fence lines. They're probably also largely responsible for it. We didn't test this directly, but there is some evidence to suggest that birds sitting on the fence and pooping out seeds might be a way that we end up with these communities to begin with. And lot interiors, especially when they're allowed to grow a little bit weedier, are actually providing a fair number of resources for pollinators who are living in urban contexts. And so this was all well and good, but it was 35 lots across the city of Chicago, and understanding biodiversity in such a heterogeneous landscape is much more, a much heavier lift. Thankfully, one of the benefits of cities is that there are lots of people out there who are engaging with the question of biodiversity through some citizen science methods. So we decided to look at iNaturalist records for this next study I'm going to share with you. And we found that in the city of Chicago and in the surrounding area, there were hundreds of thousands of iNaturalist records of research grade quality. So they've been verified at least by one other expert in the field. And we wanted to know a little bit more about this. Clearly, it's not an even sample. We've got these kind of hot spots of recording in some areas, but is there a way to not throw the baby out with the bathwater in saying this data is biased, we can do nothing with it, especially because there are people and groups and organizations who really benefit from having data and information to back up some of their grassroots organizations. And we'll come back to that idea in a little bit. And so we asked the question, like, where do these species exist? What is there? And for whom do we know what lives in their vicinity? And so we decided to take a GIS approach to clustering the characteristics of various census block groups across the region, both by their biophysical characteristics, so looking at the housing stock, looking at the land cover, looking at the current land use in these areas. And we divided the city up into these 8 different clusters. And you can see this bears out kind of in our deeply urban zones here shown in the browns and blacks, and moving further into an open space along the perimeter of the county here. The exact details of all of these things aren't exactly the most important, but I do want to point out that the differences between this yellow color and where these are located, this yellow color is high proportion of vacant space, like we were just talking about, and the green colors are going to be our more natural areas along in the outer parts of the county. We did the same thing, the same method, looking at social characteristics of the communities who live in these census block groups. We clustered the block groups based on race and ethnicity. We clustered them based on access to internet and smartphones and education, income, and language skills, as these are all things that might drive people to either participate in citizen science projects like iNaturalist, or influence their kind of connection and understanding of biodiversity benefits in an urban area. And not surprisingly, we had a couple of these different kinds of clusters that were very tightly associated. So this is a correlation matrix where the size of the circle indicates the strength of the relationship. Larger circles are a stronger correlation between clusters. And the color indicates whether it was a positive correlation or a negative correlation. And so the three I really want you to pay attention to are that we have a particular kind of syndrome of clusters that are quite low density housing, mostly white, highly vegetated. These are our suburban neighborhoods. They're typically older and wealthier homeowners living in the outer parts of the county. In contrast, we have our densely urban, high vacancy communities. These are mostly Black communities, and they are much poorer. They fall together under this kind of social and biological cluster. And on the opposite end of the kind of densely urban spectrum, we have a quite high density cluster that is mostly white communities along Lake Michigan and wealthy. These are going to be kind of your Gold Coast elite, people who are living in high-rise condos. And so the experience of nature for these different Cook County residents and what we know about the nature in their neighborhoods is going to vary tremendously. And so we constructed some species accumulation curves for each of these different clusters. The way a species accumulation curve works is that you count species diversity, so number of new species that you see on the y-axis, and for every additional observation, if you see a new species, you move up on the y-axis. If you don't see a new species and you're repeating your sampling, your graph starts to level off a little bit. And that's what we see here in our cluster for our mostly natural areas, this B4 cluster, is we've got extremely high species diversity, over 3,000 documented species, projections of about 3,700 species if we were to continue sampling. But we have kind of this diminishing return where we've got fairly comprehensive biodiversity sampling across these areas as a combination in our area. On the other side of the urban spectrum, we have very steep slopes here. First of all, we don't have a lot of species documented. Second of all, if we were to continue sampling, we would increase the relative species diversity considerably. And we don't have very many observations at all on the x-axis here. These are our high vacancy, mostly Black communities shown in yellow, and our high density white wealthy communities shown in black. And they are severely underreported in a similar fashion, despite being on such opposite ends of the spectrum. And so I want to just kind of reiterate here that different people are experiencing these lacks of data differently. People who have high impervious cover, high population density along Lake Michigan, it's a very kind of narrow strip of habitat here, are going to have a lot they're going to have a lot different resources and a lot different kind of land to manage than people who are living in these more high vacancy spaces on the south and the west sides of the city. And so really trying to understand the landscape of these reporting is important, but also trying to understand who is being affected by this lack of data. So we did the same method looking at the species accumulation curves across our social structures. And we found that language limitation is a major driver of low usership of iNaturalist and recorded diversity. Most of our Spanish-speaking neighborhoods here and our Asian populations further out in the suburbs are going to see lower reported biodiversity and lower numbers of records in iNaturalist. And all of this really matters because the data matters. The data is a way in which these communities can advocate for additional investments from the city. They can be putting together, grant proposals and things to fund grassroots greening organizations. And so I'm going to talk to you now about some of the work that I've done with a community on the Lower West Side of Chicago. This is a community called Pilsen. It is largely comprised historically of people from Mexican heritage, and has been gentrifying over the last decade or so. But it's got these deep kind of cultural roots. Pilsen is located in the heart of part of Chicago that was redlined. So I talked a little bit previously about some of these kind of federal policies that have really shaped the distribution of people in urban America. And redlining was one of these policies that declared neighborhoods that had a high proportion of Black or immigrant communities to be at risk for home loans, high risk. They would outline them in red, and they would make it very difficult to get a favorable mortgage to buy a home in those neighborhoods, which essentially pulled all of the investment right out of these communities, hollowing out a lot of the economic potential. And we see the effects of this in the environment specifically, as well as many other things. Chicago is one of the most aggressively redlined cities in the United States, largely because it is such a city of neighborhoods. And so we see that it was divided into a lot of different subsections, and the number of communities that were classified as hazardous based on these racial characteristics is higher than anywhere else in the country. And this influences things like the tree canopy cover in all of these cities. This is a really interesting paper from Dexter Locke et al., published in 2021 about the different redlining classifications and their tree cover in the modern day. And in Chicago, we see this very strong influence, whereas communities that were rated A now have quite strong tree cover. It's about a third. It's 3 times. They have 3 times higher canopy cover in highly rated neighborhoods than they do in these hazardous redlined neighborhoods. And Pilsen, of course, is one of these redlined neighborhoods. And when we look at the graph, or the map of this based on land use, we can see that this not only influences kind of the tree cover, but we've got this complete lack of citywide park space. Park space is shown in this darker green color, and there really are only a few public parks in the entire neighborhood that weren't always public parks. It's not like this is pristine landscape. This largest park in the neighborhood is called Harrison Park, and 100 years ago, it was a mining pit for lime ash for the paint industry in Chicago. It has since been filled in, but there is still a legacy of lead, and there's a lot of concrete and debris in here. Mostly right now, this park is baseball diamonds and turf grass. And so local communities see this and they feel this deeply. And there's been a lot of activism in Pilsen, particularly where there's a strong history of activism to reclaim this green space as a tremendous source of power. Green space is something that people especially care about when they are making decisions about their own space, but it's also something that we know is related to health, that we know is related to well-being, that we know is related to children having safe places to play, etc. And so I have been partnering for the last several years with a group called Women for Green Spaces that has been trying to advocate for keeping these green spaces open to the public, making sure that they are getting the tree plantings that the city is offering, and that they're trying to improve the quality of these park spaces as limited as they are. They also are encouraging people to think about green space as health and think about how they can re-engage with growing food, with building spaces for people to socialize, with reducing the burdens of noise and of pollution, using nature-based solutions as a method for promoting community health. And they are more and more becoming interested in the idea of green space as habitat. Monarch butterflies are an incredibly powerful symbol to the Mexican community because monarch butterflies make a migration from the northern part of the United States and the southern parts of Canada to the forests of northern Mexico, where they overwinter, and then they work their way back north to lay their eggs and hatch caterpillars over the subsequent summers. And so many of the Mexican immigrants or people from Mexican heritage in Chicago relate to that narrative very strongly. And so embracing the monarch butterfly as a symbol for habitat restoration has been incredibly powerful because it's a symbol that people relate to, and there is one host plant that the monarchs need. They must have milkweed along their journey, and milkweed is a gateway plant, so to speak. Planting milkweed for the monarchs is a fairly easy thing to do. The monarchs will find it, they will come, they will hatch their caterpillars out, but other species use it too. This is a milkweed plant that's got some ladybug eggs on it and all sorts of other little aphid things growing in there. And so engaging in green space activism is a way that we do a tremendous amount of good in our urban environments. However, it's not always that easy to understand where things are and what that habitat might look like. So I had a team of students from Northwestern University who were really interested in investigating this question of, how much milkweed is actually available in Pilsen, where they're interested in leaning into this system. What does the habitat resource look like? And we started with iNaturalist, and we found, there were a handful of recordings of milkweed species in the Pilsen neighborhood on iNaturalist. We suspected there were actually a lot more. And so my students spent many weeks of their summer walking down the alleys, walking up the streets, talking to people, seeing finding as much milkweed as they could and tagging the location of it. They found that iNaturalist only accounted for less than 1% of milkweeds in this neighborhood, which, if you're using this data that's so available to try and make the case that, there's this habitat resource, that doesn't tell quite the same story as when you actually go out and you ground truth that information. What this map over here tells us is that, yes, this area is alive. This area can be a sanctuary neighborhood for the monarch butterfly, and we can kind of lean into identifying areas where planting more milkweed would be really beneficial. We could lean into areas that have a high concentration of milkweed and see what other biodiversity we could add to some of their gardens to maybe support different species of butterflies or to provide some habitat for birds as well. Having the data makes a difference in these communities. And so we took this as kind of a starting tapestry to do some work at a local school. Orozco Academy is an elementary school just north of that park that used to be a mining pit. And in the summer of 2022, leaders from Women for Green Spaces and some other community volunteers got together to remove all of the ornamental daylilies from the front of the school. And we put in a native plant garden. At first, it looked kind of scrappy. There wasn't much growing up, but they had planted a variety of different Illinois deep-rooted prairie plant species, including some milkweeds, including some other host plants for other species of butterflies. And we got the kids involved. We got them out there, putting their hands in the dirt, getting a chance to examine the different kinds of seeds, looking at, what kinds of root structures grow underground in these plugs that they were planting, and taking some things home to plant in their own gardens. And this garden has really flourished over the last couple of growing seasons. We have a really well-established variety of native plants here. We are finding caterpillars in the garden all the time. Kids from the school come out and they use this as a living laboratory space where they can do some scientific exploration and really get a chance to understand not only their kind of position in the city, but also their position in the ecosystem. They get a chance to tend to these plants, to examine these caterpillars, to learn and to see what is happening in the wilder world right outside the door of their school. And so I like to kind of reflect on this quote from David Attenborough that each of us must cherish the natural world that surrounds us, from wide open countrysides to tiny patches of green in our cities. And we need to be thinking about where we can find and build and care for those tiny patches. The picture in the background here is a floating garden in Chicago called the Wild Mile. That was born out of a master's thesis and now is the world's first floating eco park. Cities are a wealth of creativity. They are ripe for growing and learning about the world that lives around us. And I would argue that making this kind of intervention in seeing the nature and the wildlife wherever we go is critical to being able to meet the challenges of the 21st century head on. With that, I would like to thank you all for joining me. I will happily open it up for questions. My email is here. Feel free to reach out at a later date if you have, other things that we don't get to talk about today, but I really appreciate everybody taking the time out of their day to be here today.
Wow, thank you, Elsa. As someone who spent most of his adult life trying to avoid cities, I have a different appreciation now and a bit more optimism. Before we start losing too many folks, I have to ask, how does your class, how could it help people perhaps, or who is your class tailored for today?
Yeah, I didn't even talk about this. So I teach a class for the Center for Wildlife Studies called Wildlife Research in Human Dominated Landscapes, which includes cities, but it also includes things like mining sites or indigenous lands. How do we bring people into the conversation of wildlife research? And so the class is really tailored for anybody who might be kind of struggling to put those pieces together. How do we rectify the data from the social science perspective with the data that is available from the ecological science perspective? How can we ask meaningful questions at that nexus? Several of the students right now work in conservation in urban land trust situations. I think I have one student who works in a conservation program from the Bronx Zoo. If you're interested in kind of these theoretical and actionable ways to marry these two disciplines together, this class is a good starting point for that.
Great, thank you. Folks, in case anyone didn't notice it, I put links in the chat for the description of Elsa's class and her profile with the Center for Wildlife Studies, and also a link to the Wildlife Wednesday program. All these recordings will be posted on YouTube. This included in coming days. If there are any questions, feel free to raise your hand or to put something in the chat. If not, you get more questions from me. Sorry.
It's all good.
Well, while we're waiting, I guess I'll ask, what has been your greatest success? What do you feel like is the thing that has been most rewarding for you in your work? If you had, well, top three, what would fall into the top three?
Yeah, I really love working with community groups, especially groups with kids, because I think that it offers such a powerful insight into where those moments of change really come from. I think probably everybody here and every ecologist or environmental professional I've talked to has that memory as a kid. For me, it was playing in a weedy little patch of woods that felt huge and probably was only like the size of my living room. As a kid, it felt wild. It felt interesting. I could be out there. My parents could see me, but I didn't feel them seeing me. And kids miss out on that. And so I like to really try and build that for people. I've done this work in Pilsen. I've also done a fair amount of work in my own local community, offering like nature play time for kids. And I just go and I answer questions for them when they have them, but I let them explore and try to facilitate that connection building. And so that's what I really love to do. But I also, I love to see communities coming together to succeed. And I see a question for how to get funding for helping communities research and steward their urban green space. That's a great question. There are so many funding sources out there, and I find that the best ones are often, they have their own local ties, local businesses, local community groups. Chicago's got a great network that exists for community gardening, and they kind of share resources across other different spaces. A lot of cities have something similar. There are also philanthropic organizations that award a lot of this work. I think the most important piece for me, coming from an academic background, has been, making sure to find the community groups to support instead of trying to do it all for them. They have a sense of what they need, and helping them find the money is just one way to kind of give back.
That's a great question.
Yeah. And another question I see, do our collaborators face pushback for trying to put native plants in lots or traditionally ornamental gardens? In the Northeast, lots of concerns about planting grasses due to worries about ticks. So this was a big concern maybe 10 years ago. I think that there has been a huge shift in Chicago towards being more accepting of native plants. One of the things that I think really, really helped with that was a fair amount of buy-in from large institutions like the Chicago Botanic Garden, Lincoln Park Zoo. These big names have really invested in local ecology and what that means. And so they're all kind of working at it from these different angles and teaching people from different perspectives. We don't have quite the same like Lyme's disease burden in Chicago as I know you do in the Northeast. But I think one of the things that is worth kind of pushing back on with this idea is that there is a native plant for every place, and you don't have to go full wild to have some of the benefits. Sometimes people want something that's lower growing, that's more showy and ornamental, and there are options for that, and presenting that as kind of the first step and knowing what that is for your ecosystem can be a really great way of bringing people in. I always suggest to people in Chicago, like if you don't want to go full in on crazy native plants, plant butterfly milkweed. It grows pretty low. It's got a nice orange flower. You're going to get the butterflies. And it's a good stepping stone. And then they kind of start to open the door a little bit. Another question. I love urban ecology. How do you allow for the wonder of children experiencing nature for the first time versus educating them on good versus bad plants? I've had kids entranced by dandelions and thistles, and I don't want to crush their wonder. This is a great point. Don't crush their wonder. Let them do the dandelions. Let the kids feed the ducks. Let the kids, pick the leaves up and play with them, because it's all a tactile experience. It's so sensory for them. And they don't need to know that dandelions are weeds until they get older, and then they have the memories of picking dandelions and thistles, because it's easy to kind of get cerebral and to shut off the wonder. So just lean in. Great question. Have you seen different patterns, nonprofits, local social groups, public parks, etc., having distinct ways and abilities to pursue this type of work? Yes. And there's always so much nuance with bringing lots of different stakeholders to the table, because everybody's got a bit of an agenda, whether they want to admit it or not. And I think that's part of what makes working in cities both frustrating and also really powerful, because they can kind of make their own decision, and it's not going to make or break the entire momentum, right? If, one organization wants to prioritize pollinator plants and another organization wants to prioritize tree planting, the city is so heterogeneous at a landscape scale that all of those things are welcome. And I would argue that all of those things are to the good if they're being done, with the mindset of trying to do some good, and you're backing that up with appropriate planning and management and investment. There are some times when it kind of clashes, where they're not on the same page. I see this often with groups of like restoration volunteers who get, really into their project, and then the city comes by and they have to mow the area between the sidewalk, and they mow back a distance to keep the sidewalks clear, and the restoration groups get mad because the city doesn't do it the right way. And so there are some moments of conflict, but I think on the whole that's just to be expected in any group where you have many chefs in the kitchen. Next question is, along those lines, do you have any tips for connecting with local policy, government, or institutions with these local groups to improve habitat, or does it not translate well with different scales of location? My biggest tip is to try and find what's going to resonate with people. I think coming in with all the facts and all the figures and all the biodiversity work, unfortunately, a lot of people don't have the kind of knowledge to talk about that as a really complex thing that it is. And so starting with the human perspective can be really beneficial. Did you know that planting, that getting to a 40% tree canopy cover will reduce heat-related mortality by XYZ percent in your district? Or did you know you have 500 open tree pits in this community? Here's a kind of a concrete plan to put those things in. And I think like that's part of the challenge in ecology, is that most of us are not trained in that kind of PR and communications work. But there is a huge amount of that when you're working with policy, when you're working with government, and being able to kind of come to the conversation again and again and again and figure out how to communicate is equally as much a part of the game, if not more, than the actual like biodiversity science.
I can argue that we have had the best questions so far in this talk among our series so far. And
Great.
I echo what you say, that I think reaching out to local groups, obviously I'm not the expert in this, but I think that would be a great place to start, because I know like where I live in Alaska, people like to plant choke cherries, which are toxic to moose. When I was in Missoula, people like to have apple trees, which can become, you know, a sort of an attractant for bears. So there's potentially a lot to consider, but I think your advice of starting small and local and working with locals is great advice. Looks like questions are tapering off and we're now
Yep.
past an hour. Again, I think this is maybe the best talk of the series, and maybe because it's so far out of my normal realm, we'll appreciate even more. A little shout out for folks, the next presentation. Well, again, first thank you, Elsa, for joining us, especially given it's after midnight where you are now. In November 19th, we are planning to have Justin Grubb give a talk on inspiring conservation through storytelling. He's an incredible filmmaker, among other things. So please tune in for that. And again, please check out our links. And if you can share this with other folks who might enjoy it, send them to the YouTube page. We're always looking for suggestions and other topics people like to hear about. And like Elsa said, if you have questions for her on this, she provided her email. There's contact information on our CWS website for any of us. Any questions, reach out anytime. And we certainly hope to see people at future talks. So thank you for tuning in, and thank you again, Elsa.
Yep. Thank you.